the policy implications. We have set the scene in the our guests have set the scene in the first panel. Now it's time to see what does all this mean for policy. For doing that, we have I will go from Joseph Glober, Senior Research Fellow, AFPRI CGIAR, sorry. Leanne Jackson, Head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division in the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Tasso Saniotis, we have met him before. David Laborde, FAO Director of Agri-Food Economics Division. And Pierre Bascou, Acting Deputy Director General in charge of International and Markets, Director for Markets, DG Agriculture, European Commission. Anne Tutweiler, Chair of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, will join us online. Let's start from a series of questions that I'll ask, and then I'll pass the floor as we have done before. I'll pass the floor to the audience for the Q&A session. I should start from Leanne Jackson. Some of the presentations were inspired by the Market Outlook report that the OECD has done. You heard the presentation, you have seen what are the priorities. In OECD countries, what type of policy are available to push in the direction indicated from the panel one? And do you see that those policies are in line with the priorities indicated in the panel one?
Okay, great. So first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here, part of this conversation, which I think is so important in terms of bridging research and science and policymakers. So congratulations to the organizers for this event. And then also to recognize all the presentations that we had just before this panel and how they've really set us up to think about the challenges that we're facing in terms of what policymakers should be thinking about and which direction policy should go. So when we at the OECD talk about agricultural policy and transformation of agriculture and food systems, we talk about how you have to balance multiple objectives. If you're a policymaker, you're talking about feeding the world, like we heard. You're talking about also livelihoods for producers, and you're talking now about doing everything in an environmentally sustainable way. And so in order to do that, you have to look at sets of policies and how policies create synergies and trade-offs. And within the OECD conversation, there's been more and more attention to looking at how we actually move towards not just measuring productivity growth, but thinking about how to measure sustainable productivity growth. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's specifically around this question around what's going on in terms of OECD policies in this space. Every year, and many of you in the room probably know this, the OECD puts together an agricultural monitoring and evaluation report where we actually have a well-established measure for support that is going to agriculture. And what we found in the most recent report, which was launched on the 6th of November, was we are seeing trends within the OECD and also other countries, because the monitoring report covers 38 OECD members but has a total of 54 countries represented. So it's a broadly global report. We are seeing movements in the right direction. So we are seeing countries thinking about how do we incentivize innovation, how do we move resources into what we call general services support in order to build up agriculture and information systems, build on extension, making sure the infrastructure and sort of conducive policy settings are in line. But actually what we saw, if you break down the support numbers that we get this year, we had over 21 and 23 an average of $842 billion in agricultural support. And this is not just subsidies, this also includes border interventions that create price support for producers. And of that, about half of it goes to direct support to farmers, and only 14% of it goes to this general services support. And here, that's pretty important. And we're actually seeing a decline in the proportion of support going in that direction, which is also really, when we're thinking about these ideas around what the sector needs to do and all the challenges that we're facing over the next coming decades, we should be moving more in that direction. So we've seen spending on agricultural innovations, for example, is about 32% of this general services support estimate. It's changed very little over the past decade. Only 15% if we look at emerging economies. So OECD members are doing more, but emerging economies like China and India and others, they're doing less. And across all the countries covered in the monitoring report, we see that innovation expenditures embedded in this account for less than 3% of the total positive support that's provided to the sector. So not necessarily moving in the right direction. We are seeing some efforts to provide incentives for farmers to pick up these new innovations, both voluntary and mandatory. And on that part of the policy setting, what's really important is that countries are thinking about how to set the objectives that they're trying to achieve and how they actually have measurement and monitoring in place so they know whether or not they're actually getting the environmental outcomes also that they're looking for when they put in these regulatory measures. Maybe just 2 words on what OECD is doing, building on comments that came in the previous panel. So earlier this month, we had a conference on sustainable productivity growth, which brought together a lot of technical experts who are actually really digging into these measurement questions across our OECD membership. We also had a global forum on agriculture, which focused on that with a little bit more on the policy angle. And here, what I think from a technical measurement angle is the interesting space is how do you take kind of classic measurement approaches around total factor productivity and complement those kinds of measurements with thinking about what environmental outcomes need to be included so that you get sort of a synthesis of outcomes and measurements around sustainable productivity growth. And then lastly, on this carbon footprint question, we're also doing work on that area within food supply chains, thinking about what kinds of mechanisms and institutional setups need to be in place so that you could have reliable and predictable measurement within supply chains. And within our country community of policymakers and experts, we're also having discussions about what would it take to start harmonizing those kinds of measurements, because we understand that there's lots of innovation going on in terms of measurement, and at a certain point, having too many kind of conflicting measures actually can lead to fragmentation, and then we're looking at trade costs and a whole nother set of cascading issues where there might be disproportionate effects for smaller producers or for least developing countries. So we are trying to move in that direction. And then finally, we're talking about facts and measurement in this setting, but I think it's also important to think about the other things that get in the way of making change. So we know that we also have interests that are interested in keeping status quo in some instances, and we also in this space have a lot of discussions around values. And maybe this is also part of the issue around new technologies that needs a little bit of unpacking, like how do we communicate about new technologies that can help us move towards sustainable productivity when there's different perceptions of what those technologies mean.
David Laborde, FAO, same questions on a global stage. Are the non-OECD countries, let's say, policy in line with the priorities our guests have told us about in the first panel?
So thanks once again for this invitation, and I am in a panel where I have people that I have the pleasure to work with for 2 decades now, I would say. And I think in the last 20 years, we have seen how the world has evolved. And to some extent, and linked to one of the facts that is pretty striking here is the share of OECD countries and the impact of OECD policies year after year start to be smaller and smaller. So what is happening in the rest of the world become more and more important. And I would say, unfortunately, we have a number of information gaps about which policies are implemented around the world. So thanks to OECD, we have more information on a number of G20 countries, and that's very important. But we are still missing policy monitoring for many large exporting or importing countries today, both in Southeast Asia or in Africa. And as it has been discussed before, and Tassos was clear about this, I mean, the scale of the change in terms of supply and demand we are going to see in the 25 years is going to be largely concentrated in Africa. And so how we are going to make sure that we have increase in production matching consumption in Africa in the next 25 years is going to be important. And the question is, with which policies? So in order to address this knowledge gap in collaboration with OECD, with the World Bank, with the Inter-American Development Bank, we have this consortium called Ag Incentive Consortium, where actually we bring information together, and at FAO, in particular, we concentrate on a number of low and middle income countries. And so what we see is, yes, if you go in low and middle income countries, you see very, I would say, traditional farm policies that are production oriented and input use oriented, including with very large subsidies, for example, for fertilizer. So you go in India, you are going to see a tremendous amount of subsidies in fertilizer. Now, I mean, the input subsidies in India exceed the total budget of the CAP. Okay, that's the order of magnitude. You go in Indonesia, 80% of the budget of the agricultural policy in Indonesia is fertilizer subsidy. And we know it's actually, yes, it contributes to producing more, but not in the good way, and with a lot of negative externalities, including a lot of soil degradation, for instance. So we need to see this shift in terms of policies, and also because I would say the learning experience in terms of policies up to today is a bit more limited at the global scale, including among low and middle income countries, that what we have seen in OECD countries in the last 20 years, where monitoring was the starting point, but then discussing policies. And also, I will add that the WTO also has, and the UN has led to rethink some of these policies, but with stronger disciplines, even if it's far from being perfect, in some high-income countries than, of course, in low-income countries. So we really need to move the things in the right direction, knowing that, as we have seen, I will say, in the case of Europe, we have seen how the common agricultural policy has evolved over 40, 50, 60 years, and doing major changes, and in many cases moving in the right direction. I think we have seen how China also has followed a similar trajectory, doing in some cases a mistake of the past, but trying to correct them fast. But yes, what we will need in Africa is actually getting things at a much quicker speed, because we are going to add more or less 1 billion people in a continent today that is already a major food importer. And I will say the aspect around which I am a bit also more optimistic on some case of its projection, especially when they are driven by partial carrier model, is we assume that these countries are going to have the money to pay for their imports. And it's not going to be the case. And so we really need to make sure that, yes, we need to increase production, even more we need to increase productivity, but in specific places. I'm going to stop here, and with the right policies, and then we will continue, I think, on this question.
Of course. Pierre Bascou, food inflation hit Europe in a particular manner. It was what the European Commission is doing on that. What are the measures that you took? You put in place. There are observatories. There are, you know, we have heard also about the transparency in price signal. What's the European Commission doing for address this question, and how to address it better, maybe?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question, and I would like also to thank, I think, the organizers. I think I'm very happy, I think, to be here, and I'm also very positive. I've listened very carefully to Tassos, and I'm very happy to see that even I think after retirement, Tassos is even more productive and innovative. So this gives us also very positive perspective over the long term. So we're not only talking about baseline and outlook, market outlook. No, more seriously, I think to answer to your question, and I think this was very well reflected, I think, by John in his presentation. Food price inflation has been very high, I think, in the EU. I think we are now, below 2% on a monthly basis. But I think clearly, I think it was in the beginning of 2023, I think we were at level close to 20% on average in the EU, and in certain countries are more than 60%. And I think this is something which is really unprecedented in the. We have been with Tassos, I think, in this business for quite a long time. And apart from 2008, where we had a bit of food inflation, I think we have never seen such a high level of food inflation and food price inflation. And one element that John, I think, also underlined that is very important is that if now food price inflation has gone down to below 2%, in absolute terms, the prices of food are much higher, and I would say very significantly higher, I think, than what they were before the COVID pandemics, before the energy crisis, and I think before the war of aggression, I think, of Russia against Ukraine. So clearly, I think this has a major impact on the food supply chain in the EU. I think both on consumers, on farmers, but also on the cost structure in the intermediate stages, I think, of the food supply chain. And this has triggered, I think, a very swift, I would say, policy response by the European Commission, and also, I think, by public authorities in the member states. I think first, I think, on consumers, I think we have been very active in basically providing social support, I think, to the most vulnerable parts of our society through support to the food banks, also the support, I think, for the granting of vouchers, I think, for the low income, I think, part of our society. We have also increased, I think, support, I think, to school schemes, so making fruit, vegetables, and dairy product, available at a larger scale, I think, for to children. We have also encouraged member states, and quite a few of them did that, to lower the rate of VAT on the prices of staple food in order to make food, I think, more affordable for the consumers. We have also been active, I think, for the farmers, encouraging member states, I think, to use this common agricultural policy that David was talking about, to use it in order to stimulate investment, to stimulate innovation, to stimulate, I think, the uptake of risk management tools in order to increase, I think, productivity growth and the level of production in the EU. But we have been also very active, I think, on the functioning of the food chain. On the thing of the food supply chain, it's clear that I think during this, over the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, I think during this difficult period, we have seen a lot of mistrust and lack of confidence between the different actors, I think, of the chain, between the farmers, the processing industry, and I think, and the retail sector. And it has been very important, I think, for us, I think, to act to make sure that I think the single market in the EU is functioning. And this is paramount importance in order to keep prices, food prices, I think, as low as possible. And we have seen in some countries that tried, I think, to isolate themselves in order to be autonomous or self-sufficient. We have seen the prices going through the roof at more than 50%. So the functioning of the single market was very important. The maintenance of competition rules was also, I think, very, very important for food affordability, but also for food availability, because we shouldn't forget that in the beginning of the COVID crisis, there have been some regions where basically the availability of food, I think, was at risk. And what we have done, and this is what you refer to, is that we have tried also to develop the system of market observatory. And lately, I think we created the AFCO, the Agri-Food Chain Observatory, in order to bring more transparency, more information, more evidence, more facts, in order for the whole chain, I think, to better understand, I think, the functioning of the chain, to have a better information regarding prices, regarding cost, regarding margin, and basically regarding the distribution of value added. So we are at the beginning of this process. I think this type of the observatory exists in 7 or 8 countries. We are trying to develop that now at EU level. We started in the beginning of the year. I think we met, I think, only twice, I think, this year, but I think we're going to try to expand that. And we hope that, I think, by increasing the level of transparency and trust in the chain, that we are going to contain, I think, the inflation and improve, I think, the efficiency in the functioning of the food supply chain. And I would say in policy terms, and I would say even in political terms, I think this is very important because it is extremely important for the farmers, but also for the consumers to understand exactly, how prices are generated, where they are coming from, prices increases or decreases, and to make them, accept, I think, the market orientation which have been introduced in the CAP more than 30 years ago, because clearly, if the food supply chain doesn't work, it will be very important. It will be very difficult, I think, for us to continue, I think, in this market orientation and ensure that I think this is a market who are driving food production and agricultural production in the EU. So in a nutshell, I think this is what we have done for this inflation. Things are coming down now. This is good, but still, I would like to insist on that. I think food prices at a rather high level, and this is something which is driving, I think, a lot of concerns and attention from our side. Thank you.
Anne Tutwiler. The perspective of gain is the point of view of gain is the point of view of diets but diets need to be both nutrition and affordable. Can you share your thoughts on that, on what you have seen so far, what you have listened to so far?
Well, thank you very much for including me. I am pleased to see and hear so many of my colleagues for some over 35 years. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person myself. But let me first say, when we talk about affordability of healthy diets, we're often speaking about it in terms of what individual consumers can afford, right? But really, we have to ask the question of how affordable are these diets for society? We are expending tremendous amount of resources on non-communicable diseases caused by unhealthy diets, and countries where malnutrition is a problem or undernutrition is a problem, they are not only incurring healthcare costs, but also the loss of economic development because people who are malnourished don't have capacities to do the kinds of work that will generate higher income for them, but also higher GDP. So I just want to put this in a slightly bigger framework before I get down to the specific answers. So I think there are a couple of things on the supply side. We've been talking so much in today's meeting about the big commodity crops, and those are the ones that have gotten the vast majority of research funding, both through the CGO and also in our countries and in the private sector. We have not been supporting research into fruits and vegetables and crops with higher nutrition that can make them more efficient, safer, and more environmentally sustainable. So first of all, directing more research funding into these kinds of more nutritious crops. We all know that there are high levels of waste in fresh fruits and vegetables and fish and other highly nutritious crops. So investing in better cold storage, both at individual farm level, but also at collection points, and addressing other ways to reduce wastes in that system, because the waste takes a slice out of producers' incomes, but it also costs consumers in the end. Enhancing food safety and quality standards. And I had a big question when I started with GAIN of why is GAIN working on food safety issues on fruits and vegetables? Well, in a lot of developing countries, the perception that fresh fruits and vegetables are not grown in a safe manner, that the water supply used is not safe, that they're over fertilized and sprayed with pesticides, et cetera, actually reduces the demand for fresh fruits and vegetables. So working on food safety is a critical piece of this. And the last two things I would say on the supply side, one is incentivizing private sector innovation. And Leanne mentioned the lack of investment sort of in general services, in logistics, and helping private sector address logistics and storage solutions. And finally, I think we need to start holding companies to account on their nutritional offerings. And the World Benchmarking Alliance, which I'm part of as well, has a third of the weightings for private sector companies on nutrition. And they're not doing well. They're not doing well at all. And we need to be more public about the failings of some of our biggest private sector companies in offering better nutrition. So quickly on the demand side, I think someone mentioned the importance of school feeding and social protection programs that are providing better nutrition to children, but also their families on healthy and nutrition-dense food. Scaling up workforce nutrition programs, which is something GAIN is doing in a lot of developing countries with major companies, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 person companies, which are beginning to offer workplace nutrition that is making a big difference in people's lives. Promoting food as medicine, and I don't mean this in a very technical way, but we know that diet is a huge cause of major non-communicable diseases that are costing societies a lot of money. If we can start prescribing food solutions rather than Ozempic and rather than all the insulin and everything else, it will make a huge dent in healthcare costs, but also in improving people's lives. And then I would say the last thing is really helping to make food more accessible, in addition to affordable, to particularly low-income consumers, like farmers markets, better access for food in urban markets in particular. I could go on, there are lots of solutions, but just to highlight a few that GAIN and a number of others are working on. Thanks.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Now, yes. And Joe Glober, there was another term of the very complex equation we are dealing with today that it was mentioned many times. It's trade. Trade was covering the gaps. He's covering the gaps sometimes, but now we find ourselves in a situation which is not clear what will happen also after the US elections, for instance. Do you see those geopolitical related trade tensions as a real risk for food supply? Are they on the rise and they are a risk for food supply in your view?
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks for the question, I think. Yeah, there's no question. I mean, you look at the last 6 years or so, we've had, gone from back in 2018 or so with the US-China trade war, going into COVID, which with these big supply chain disruptions, going into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I would add in things like India's export restrictions on rice, which had very large implications for countries, importing countries in West Africa, or in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Yeah, I think there's no question with the return of President Trump for his second term, one thing that has been on top of that agenda that he's been very clear on is that he likes tariffs, he wants to impose tariffs. It's one thing actually he can do day one. There's a lot of discussion on legal authorities, how far he could go, but I think it's been very clear that he is intent on hitting China with another big round of tariffs. And remember that the last trade war with the US, much like the disputes that we've seen with the EU and China and other things, they involve agriculture, but agriculture is not the reason there's a trade war. But it is very significant collateral damage because that's the easy place to strike back. If someone's raising tariffs or not letting EVs into your country, or not, you want to keep out imports from China. China retaliates by putting on tariffs on agricultural goods. And clearly, I just drawing on the experience of 2018 to 2020, we saw, U.S. producers, particularly soybean producers, big losers. 25% of every, of soybeans that were produced at the time were going to China. when that stopped, those soybeans had to find a new home. I remember President Juncker, I think, because of the dispute the Trump administration was having with EU on steel, he generously said, well, we're willing to import US soybeans. But of course, Brazil, which had been supplying a lot of soybeans to EU, was sending them to China. So it was the US, in fact, did increase soybeans to Brazil. But overall, down about, I think, 18, 20 million tons exports for that year. So very, very different, so that hurt a lot. On the other hand, China was hurt by having to pay a lot higher prices for soybeans. So yes, they also were hurt by those actions. The big winner, of course, Brazil, because Brazil was able to supply those soybeans. And I think if you look over a period of around 3 years, starting in 2019, Brazil brought in 2 million hectare per year on average of new soybean area. I mean, that's a lot of soybeans. And I think, thankfully, that didn't all come out of forest or all out of pasture conversion, because also what Brazil was doing over that period is doing a lot of intensification of growing a second crop of corn, and they were able to, the overall increases in the area weren't nearly as big as the numbers I just gave you. But it's just to say these things have big ramifications. That is just a very bilateral trade relationship. If we're talking about across-the-board tariffs on countries, I think that could have, from the US side, then that I think brings a whole other range of questions, and trying to assess those impacts I think is very difficult, largely because they've mainly been talked about in the press. No real details. Does that mean every tariff would be raised to 10%? Would it be a supplemental 10% on top of existing tariffs? All those questions, we don't know, but I think we do know the impacts of increased tariffs, and that is likely have retaliatory impacts with very little salutary impacts in the US, because I think that clearly that doesn't mean that US producers are all that material that normally would have been exported now isn't going to be necessarily consumed at home. What happened last time, a lot went into stocks, and you did see drops in production. And so I think that I think we're in for a very interesting period, to say the least. And let's not forget there's a WTO out there as well, which has been weakened because we haven't had an appellate body for how long now? 8 years, or 6 years or so. And we're into a period where hopefully those institutions won't get undermined as well. I'll leave you with that happy, cheery thought.
Daniotis, let's get back to Europe.
May we live in interesting times. As I said.
Yeah, in these interesting times, let's get back to Europe. What are the main threats and the opportunities arising from this scenario for the domestic policy, EU policy, so for the CAP essentially, and other food policies?
Well, starting with some of the issues that Joe has raised, some of you know that I've spent 11 years of my life in the US. And I've always used this argument, whether there or here, that the US and the EU are at the same time the largest partners and the largest competitors. But I have the tendency to put the accent more on the competitor's side than the partner side. Now, we're living in times where all this notion of the end of history has died long ago, but this notion that we're living in a world that is based on rules and law, I mean, we cannot have this type of illusions anymore. As a result of that, it would be really strange, you can find other words to put in there instead of strange, to face a situation where at the time that you need to strengthen the relationships with those that have similar values with you, you find yourself fighting more exactly with these particular parts of the world. And that's the real pity in this situation, because we're going into major realignments of geostrategic dimensions that we don't even know where they're going to land. And we will waste a lot of energy and money and what have you in fighting for what in the big picture is really minor. Now, in terms of the other challenge that I see in the European Union, and the one that has been much more closer to my heart and relates to some of the issues that were raised by Liane as well. I think the biggest challenge we face is how to marry economic and environmental dimensions of our policies. And there is something that the OECD used to produce. You were in WTO at the time, not OECD. But it was called jointness, and they made a party in a sketch he was playing, mocking me when I retired, because of my stressing this word. Now, jointness is a complex word coming from production economics, but it's a simple one at the same time. Do we admit that a farmer is at the same time an economic actor and an actor that provides environmental services? We have been saying that forever. What does it mean in practical terms in the policy formation? For me, it means two very concrete things. First, whatever policy you have to cover all area and all land. And stop this debate, public money for public goods. The private goods have major failures as well. The discussion about food inflation is as an example. Second, we need to reassess the prioritization we had in certain aspects of our policy. In the public debate, we have been debating biodiversity, emissions, water, and at the end, we put soil. For me, soil comes first. And comes first because if you address soil health, you address all the other three dimensions. And by addressing soil health, you focus on the definition, the better definition of sustainable productivity we have been discussing, because you have a better leverage with your policy around the soil because its payments are area-based. You have better leverage in terms of the redistribution of support with a more targeted logic. And here is an area where, in my view, we haven't really even started focusing much because it relates to issues that are sensitive in the policy debate, right? Redistribution of support and the manner by which we condition the type of support we have. Now, to be able to do things like that, you need to focus on the pertinent numbers, and you need to come up with an analysis that would dare to ask the difficult questions in an independent way. Politicians have to take difficult choices. I don't think any of us envy their role, otherwise we would be politicians. But in these difficult choices, they need to have a very clear idea about what are the pros and the cons of the different options that they face. And frankly, and that's what scares me, I don't see it lately as much as I used to do in the past, neither in the European Union nor globally. And we have already paid the price, and I think we're going to pay a much greater price by jumping into a global theater where people were setting targets out of the blue, competing how to raise these targets even higher, and they never stopped asking the question, are we really that perfect? Or have we missed something and we need to go back to the basics? So that's what I see the biggest challenge right now facing the debate that we're having, that we have forgotten that the starting point of any solid policy decision is solid policy analysis.
I would open the Q&A session now. Who wants to ask the first question? The rules, let's say, are the same of the first panel. Tell us who you are and who you want to address your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Liam McHale from the Irish Farmers Association. Just picking up on the last point that Tassos mentioned, I think that solid analysis within the agriculture sector is now being termed under benchmarking. And I think it was a failure that 5 or 10 years ago, before the regulations were introduced, that we didn't measure and inform our farmers how much carbon do they have, how can they increase it, and what causes it to decrease. It would have perhaps taken a little bit of the challenges we now face out of the issue. I want to come back to Pierre. When you talked about price, food inflation, and prices have come down, but you said they're still higher than where they were. But do we know if farmers are receiving more into their pockets? Because my farmers are telling me that their costs have increased, and very often they are in a worse position. And finally, to David, you talked about fertilizers. The EU is looking to protect production of fertilizers, and there are subsidies, there are anti-dumping duties, which our farmers see as unfair, because they're paying prices in Europe that are higher for fertilizers than outside of Europe. I'm just wondering if you have a comment in how we should best address competitiveness in the European fertilizer sector. Thank you.
So Pierre Bascu.
Yes. Maybe I think two comments. Well, an answer I think to the first 2 points I think that you raised. I think the first one about measuring performance. It is clear that I think in my view we have a difficulty in the EU, but I think this is the same when we are discussing with our US counterparts, etc. But I think we have difficulty to measure the sustainability performance at farm level. And this is being reflected in the policy debate about, what Tassos mentioned. We are reducing greenhouse gas emission. We are improving, I think, the use efficiency of fertilizer or many other input, etc. And still, agriculture is often, accused, I think, of being, a polluter, I think, on the environment, I think, for the climate, etc. And that we need to do more. And it is clear that I think we need to do more, but I think it to be important in policy term and political term, I think, to be able to recognize, I think, what has been achieved. And of course, I think for producers, in order to increase, I think, their productivity, it will be important to be able to know where they stand, at what level of performance they stand, and in order to further improve that. In terms of prices, clearly, I think the prices of agricultural products have increased in the EU. I think you are Irish. I think beef prices are rather high. If you look at milk prices right now, we are at more than 50 cents, I think, per liter in the EU. So yes, agricultural prices are high, but I think the production costs are even higher in certain regions and for certain sectors. And I can refer to fertilizer prices, which are still 60% higher than I think before the energy crisis. I think we can talk about energy prices, and John, I think, has been quite and shown, I think, graphs, I think, which are quite telling. So for us, what is important is not only a question of price, it's a question of value added. Where are the margins? How are they distributed? And it's a question about, to see that I think this increase in production cost is properly transmitted along the food chain. And clearly, over the last few years, we have seen that this transmission is very often asymmetric. It's only partial. And it is taking a lot of time, I think, to go through, I think, the whole food chain. So this is important, I think, for us, I think, to make sure that I think the food chain in the EU functions, I think, much better. But I think what is the case. But I think clearly, in terms of prices and margins, I think we have seen some diverging orientation and changes, I think, depending on the sector.
There was a question also for David, I think, on fertilizers.
Yes, but before I jump to fertilizer, I want to talk about two related things. First, this question of food price inflation is something that you see actually globally. And if you think about the result of the US election, you will see that this is something that is pretty important too about what people are looking on a daily basis. And that's going to be the thematic topic of one of our flagship publications, the State of Food Security and Nutrition for next year. So keep focused on that, but we are going to have partnership with different actors on this because that's a global concern. And I think, as Tassos has said, food security is a global concern, and that's pretty important. The other aspect I want to point to is during the last COP last year, we introduced this global roadmap to achieve food security in the context of climate action, really to talk about this jointness to some extent, and to say that we cannot deal with these two global public goods in a competitive manner, but how we can deliver on this. And in these efforts, we escalate also the, I would say, yes, there is food security and nutrition, there is climate action, but at the end, there is a big discussion on productivity. Because the only way to reconcile all of this is to deal with productivity, especially when we define it in a sustainable manner. And that's for us key milestones, you know. If we don't measure carbon properly, if we don't measure soil health, if we don't measure productivity, we are moving in the dark. And I really want to focus on what Tassos have said about, we have a multiplication of targets. We have people that are negotiating indicators that even in 15 years from now, we will not be able to put a number on it. And there is a competition for the best when what we need is a good. We need something that is imperfect but operational in order to guide these policies. And I think that's where also this question is going to be important for the fertilizer discussion, you know. What type of regulation, what type of prices, what type of incentive we want for farmers to be able to deliver these sustainable productivity gains, and where we can see also from one market structure or one policy setting to another what works. Now, yes, the European Union has a number of relatively protectionist policy around fertilizer, but there is also a geopolitical dimension on it. Of course, I mean, if you still need to import your natural gas to produce your fertilizer at home, that doesn't make you more autonomous. But I think we have to really be clear that, you know, what are the inputs that are needed and at which cost for farmers, because it's not because commodity price go up and down that systematically the margin for the fertilizer, for the farmers go up and down. So really we have to look at every time at the cost of output and the cost of inputs. Now, this question of level of competition on the fertilizer policy situation in Europe is a pretty important one. I think the Commission has looked at it. We know that farmers in Europe are concerned about it. Now, you know, what should be the optimal trade policy? In a context that today is different from 10 years ago, I will just be careful about drawing some conclusion. We need just also more transparency about, you know, what are the margins done by different actors. And that's basically true for people that are using food product and transform them, but are also pretty important on the input side. We talk about fertilizer, but for seeds, for other elements, you know, that's going to be important. So that I would say, yes, a bit more transparency and really monitoring this input cost. At the same time, we monitor the output cost.
Other questions?
I'd like to come in if I could.
Anne, please.
Just on this question, just to add a complication to what David and Tassos and others have said, you know, if we increase sustainable productivity in a set of crops that are not particularly nutritious, we have missed the mark on a big part of what the food system is supposed to be delivering to people. So I think we need to add an element to these data sets about how nutritious is the food that is being produced in a more efficient, sustainable way. Because if we don't, we're going to end up with, you know, maybe less food insecurity in terms of calories, but not an improvement in nutrition and a deterioration of health. And if I could also just come in on one point, you know, Joe talked about the, you know, likely impact of the incoming president's priorities. You know, inflation was a huge issue in the election, as somebody alluded to, but the other big issue was immigration. And if we end up seeing, you know, a huge deportation in the US, and I think, you know, other countries are having pressures about immigration as well, that is going to add to food price inflation, because the reality is that many of the immigrants are working in the poultry sector, in the pork sector, in the beef sector, in harvesting fruits and vegetables. And we risk losing that supply of labor, and that those jobs are not going to be filled.
I want to come back to a point on nutrition that unraised. I don't disagree with what she said, but I think there is a different dimension in the sense that a lot of times when we talk about policy, and especially when we talk about the subsidization of policies, let's look at, and there's a book about it, on sugar, fat, salt. Okay, salt is a mineral, but sugar and fat are coming from the agricultural sector. But the manner by which they become healthier and healthy does not depend on production agriculture. It depends on choices made usually at food processing. And this is one of the big contradictions, if you want to that we have in terms of the policy we're making, because the manner by which producers produce the food to a large extent depends on what we have been telling them for decades, become market-oriented. And they have become much more market-oriented, become more environmentally friendly. They haven't done it yet, but some of it, at least in this process of doing it. Now, how do you change this pull that you have from the market depends to a very large extent on choices that are being made by the food industry. And they tend to have sometimes an extremely distorting aspect. And, I mean, I witnessed it when I was based in Washington some years ago, and it was the beginning of the biotech debate, how easily some supermarkets decided this is GMO-free. And they impacted the whole manner by which the whole process was doing without even knowing what they were promising. So this is a big contradiction that we have in terms of policy. I saw it when I was in the Commission, that a lot of what was being asked by the Common Agricultural Policy to do is beyond the scope of the Common Agricultural Policy. And I think we do have generally a lack of policy measures that would allow us to do exactly what you said, Dan.
Other questions?
Thank you. Well, you know, since some months I'm thinking about this one. So Europe was a great leader on the climate policy by setting this ambitious target of the climate neutrality of by 2050. But it seems that we somehow did not really benefit from it. Actually, the Green Deal was a big argument for the populist parties gaining substantial positions either in the national governments or in the European Parliament. And then we have seen the Draghi report, right? And I started to think, okay, it's maybe not the fault of the Green Deal, but it is the fault of all the rest that we were not able to make profit and benefit from the Green Deal, while others were in a way, because we have seen the development of the photovoltaic production in China flooding the markets, the same way Tesla, together with the biggest Chinese car maker, fighting for the first position in the production of the electric vehicles. And now the question for this forum. Should we expect something like this happening also for the agri or agri-food business? That actually, while in Europe we will be very ambitious and thinking about how we make the environmental sustainability and so on, potentially even at the cost of the farmers' businesses and so on, there will be others who will run over us and they will make real profits from actually an environmentally sustainable production. And whoever picks it up, I think...
Who want to pick it up?
Let me just talk briefly, or address that briefly from say, the U.S. perspective, or at least how the U.S. views this, because, you know, U.S. farmers have been very much anti-regulations. You know, the 2009, when the U.S. did debate a climate bill, you know, all the analyses were showing up actually fairly small costs that would have been imposed on the agricultural sector by virtue of higher energy costs. But in perspective, and particularly, John showed all the variation from year to year. In perspective of the overall volatility, pretty small number. But all the same, very much opposed. And I think that lesson was sort of taken to heart. So the sort of climate proposals that have been for U.S. is subsidize producers to do something, that will gain environmental benefits. Well, obviously the problem is how do you get the additional farmer to do that practice? Because some are already doing that practice. So immediately you have this issue of do you have to pay everyone? Or do you have this person who was doing that practice says, well, I'm not going to do it for a year so I can get money from now on to do it. So the marginal benefit of that is actually fairly small. And then there's all the other things that how do you make sure they continue to do that practice? And then your issue about measuring is even more important. So I'm not sure that's the route either, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think that again, I also feel very strongly that measurement is very important here, not just for benchmarking purposes for farmers, which was alluded to in the last question, but also for the public. So the public knows what they're getting out of, if we're going to subsidize for these things, that the public should know what they're getting, what sort of public good they're getting out of it. Sorry.
So I have Pierre Bascu, David, and Tassos.
Maybe I think just one word, I think, to complement what Joe was saying, but I fully share. It is clear that I think in the EU, I think this sustainability orientation for us is not, I think, a choice. I think whether we need to do it or not, I think we have to do it. And I think, and we clearly see over the last 2 or 3 years, extremely and adverse, and exceptional, weather events, etc. We see productivity which is stagnating. We see, I think, the emergence or the re-emergence, I think, of pests, of animal disease, etc. So we do believe that I think we need to enhance, I think, the level of sustainability and resilience of our farm sector. Unfortunately, I think in this debate over the last few years, I think we forgot to talk about, competitiveness, about viability, about profitability, because clearly agriculture is an economic activity. And as Tassos, I think, this join us, and I fully agree with him. I think, we are first an economic activity, but it delivers, I think, public goods. So I think this orientation, I think, and this transition towards sustainability is very important. I think the big difficulty is the question of measurement, to be able to reflect what has already been done, I think, to our consumers, because we shouldn't forget that also with the consumer demand and with the societal demand. I think citizens are asking for more sustainable product, I think more healthy product, etc. So we need, I think, to move into this direction. The big difficulty for us, beyond, I think, the measurement, is the financing, because clearly, I think the cost of the transition is very important. Now we are at a time where food prices at a rather high level. There's much less inflation, but prices are very high. I think margins are under pressure, and it is clear that I think to further finance, I think this transition is very difficult, I think, for the farm sector. And this is one of the constraints, I think, that we are facing right now, is how far can we go while I think making food still affordable, I think, by the vast majority of people. And it's clear that I think the economic context right now is much less supportive than it could have been a few years ago. But I think for us, I think one of the biggest constraints in the EU is the energy market and the energy prices. And John mentioned it. I think when you have your main energy, supply, I think sources which are 4 times higher than in the rest of the world, and in the US in particular, clearly this is impacting our competitiveness. So we need to really continue to support, I think, this transition, and to make consumer much more aware, of what is being done. But this is, a delicate balance. And at the same time, we need also to be less reliant on, third countries. We're talking about fertilizers. I think clearly now in the EU, for most fertilizers, we are depending on 2 or 3 sources from countries, which sometimes are not the most reliable, partners that you would dream about. So yes, I think there's a fine balance, but clearly I think the direction of travel, I think, remains the same.
So I will start by trying to not forget that when we talk about sustainability, there are 3 dimensions of sustainability. when you think about the UN agenda. Economic, so yes, farmers still need to make a living and to make a profit out of what they do. The social, we have to think about redistribution across consumers and across farmers, and then the environmental sustainability. But when you have a debate that just starts with the last one, you are losing the discussion. I mean, that's pretty clear, and that's why I was referring to a roadmap before. We start with, you have a social goal that is getting good food for all, okay? And that everyone can accept it. But we will not be able to do it if we don't do the climate action, as you say, because our productivity is going to be eroded with climate change, and actually we may try to use climate finance to the sectors in agriculture that can deliver this. Because the second point also, we should not lie to ourselves. When we say the world will be net zero, it means that agri-food system and land use will be net carbon sink. It's not the rest of the economy that is going to capture carbon at scale in the next 25 years. And so if we ask this sector to deliver so much, we need to invest much more, public and private money. There is no free lunch. And this message has to be clear. And if the society doesn't want to pay for it, that's okay. But then, once again, we will not achieve the targets we have. And that's where actually the engagement also with the farmers are very important, both in terms of narrative and tools, meaning that having newspaper that say farmers are destroying the planet, that's not great to engage with them, because that's not why they wake up the morning. Most farmers have actually a difficult life. That's true in Europe, that's true in India, that's true in Zambia. And so what they want is, yes, they can be actors of change, but the society should give them the financial tools and even the technological tools, because in some cases you are basically farmers, you have to improve, but how we are going to do it? What is the package of solution we can deploy? And not through micromanagement saying, do this, do that, they are not civil servants, but making sure they have the tools. So I think that's where we can do it, because if we don't solve this political economy problem, it's a dead end. And so it has to be taken from the beginning. Yes, we need these actors on board. And around the world, we will find different ways to finance it, but that has to be clearly on the targets.
Tassos, and we have other two questions I've seen, at least.
When Peter asked the question, I agree with what you said, so I will add a different angle, because my mind went immediately to similar discussions and debates we had on food safety issues. Because we had all this, it's going to increase the cost of production, what will happen to an agriculture? Well, we managed to adapt. We managed to adapt, and not only that, but we created an agro-food sector based on value added that is recognized as actually creating frontiers in terms of where you have to set the standards. So if you compare that with what happened with the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork, what comes to my mind, and I've written on an article on LinkedIn, shocked by what one scientist told me in a conference in Paris, is, if we get half of what we ask for, we are happy. And I told him, do you listen to what you say? Because in the public domain, if you get half of what you ask for, that's a major policy failure. And I think this is the biggest problem we have had. I mean, we never proposed in the 2019 CAP reform any targets, and we made a lot of analysis and overall orientation. The targets came afterwards. And let's compare three of them. Where is the debate on the use of antibiotics? There is no debate, because we have started this process. It increased the costs, but it also provided benefits. And the 50% wasn't even an issue. I mean, we were discussing because it was already met. We introduced a target on organic farming that had no relations whatsoever with reality. This was a demand-driven sector based on value added. It had nothing to do with area and an imposition. And we turned a sector that was on its own a living lab of what best practices could do from a demand-driven sector into a subsidy-demanding sector. And then one of the last things I remember I did is I was defending, and we managed to get it, thanks to the French presidency at the time also in its role, member states giving us data on fertilizers by 2028 instead of 2032. But the target that we have is by 2030. So you set a target without a baseline. And that is not European. It is global. It is part of all these sustainability development goals. Somebody says 40%, somebody will say 50, somebody will say 60, as if it's a competition of how big we blow a balloon. And that is, in my view, the problem that we have right now. And we have to go back to the basics with some concrete examples to get farmers on board and consumers on board on what is achievable. And there are many things that are out there that are achievable right now that we don't advertise, maybe because they're not that sexy in the political debate.
First, okay, you have already the microphone. Okay.
Do you hear it? Yeah. Okay, Bart van de Water from Nestlé. So Tassos and Anne, you mentioned, of course, food processing sector. I just wanted to address one point, and you said it, Tassos, in your intervention, you talked about sugar, fat, salt. I think we need to speak also about protein in that same context as well. But the main point you said was the CAP is not able to capture this. Exactly. And that is indeed why I think it's good to see that there is a commissioner for agri and food now. Now we need to concretize it. So let's see what will come out of this, and curious to hear from Pierre on the 100 days document that was promised. Exactly also to the point, it's not only about the nutrition, but if you, to the colleague of FAO, when you spoke about the farmers and the headline in the media, it's exactly that. What can we do together? If we look at where we are in transition to regenerative agriculture, which is for me sustainable productivity, you see we start well, but it's those that are convinced, it's those that are in trouble themselves, but now we get to a ceiling. So if we don't have a holistic policy getting everybody around the table, the financing, private, public together, the ceiling is there. And we will not get much beyond 20% in regenerative agriculture.
What is the question?
Exactly. No, and that is exactly the point that I would like. What do the panelists believe that how we can make it happen from where we were looking this afternoon very much to agriculture? How can we look beyond? And the final point is, one thing in the analysis as well is the retail. This is very different in Europe versus all the other continents. We haven't discussed about that, but it's a huge difference as well for Europe, and something that is not being considered. So again, it's about thinking much beyond just purely agriculture to see how we can help agriculture.
Who wanna pick this up?
So I can follow up on the question on regenerative agriculture, and I will say first, I think that's where it's important to have data and metrics and not getting people fighting for how you call things. Because you have some part of the world where everything has to be called agroecology. Other part when it has to be called organic. When you have a part of the private sector that say, I want to talk about regenerative agriculture. And people will say, oh, it's supposed to be climate smart agriculture. And when you say, okay, can we just discuss about what are your metrics of performance? Then people start to agree. But otherwise, it's political things, you know? And then you have to say, no, but you are not using the right word because it's a US word or it's a European word. And that's not going to help. So I think that's where, you know, making sure the private sector try to monitor things that also the public sector try to monitor, that the way that we talk about productivity at a country level and performance of farm is done in a consistent manner. That's where we should aim for. And what we want is really this, and I think it's something that come back from the two sessions of today, is we are in a period of time where cooperation and coordination across public actors, across border is difficult. And that's the time where we really need it. And it's not going to come from political commitments, but maybe on some technical discussion, you know, because what China wants for Chinese companies and Chinese consumers is actually not too different from what the EU wants when you say, okay, we have a problem of water pollution, we have this, we have that. Now, they may not agree publicly, but in terms of what are the data sets we need to make sure our policies are going in the right direction, that I think there is space for OECD, there is space for FAO, and other partners to come, because also now the global south should be there. And yes, on the retail part, I would just say, yes, we really have to be this agri-food system thinking, you know. Now, something we try also to say is not like if everyone should try to solve all the problems. We need to have a strategic vision, and after, its DG, its ministries, its companies have to have a set of action in its space. But otherwise, we don't have accountability anymore. You know, if we are all responsible for everything, no one feels responsible. When accountability, I think, is a key issue. And when we were talking about data, that's what data actually is central in terms of change, is to see what the problem is, to make sure that we are having a system of incentive and payment for the right things. And also at one point, we have accountability, you know? Because otherwise, yes, we define these targets, we don't measure them, and after we just change the targets after 10 years.
I can take the last question. I think it was, yeah.
Thanks. Agnese Boccalon from ACR Plus. I'm area lead of Sustainable Food System at my organization. We are a Brussels-based network of public authorities. I have two questions for Mr. Bascu. Before you talk about two things, first, that the Commission supported the work of food banks in the food redistribution process, especially during the COVID time. Evidence from our members brings actually a different picture. There is no public support to food banks' work. They are entities that do a lot of jobs based on voluntary work, and they are based on donations from foundations. So I would like to ask what is the support that the Commission provided to the food banks, networks, and institutions? And the second question is also on what you mentioned about food prices transparency. What is the, if you can give a bit more explanation about what is the platform or information that the Commission is working on to increase transparency on food prices for consumers, looking at all the aspects of the food.
Much, I think, for these two questions. Well, I think on the first one, I think on the support, I think for Food Bank, this is done in the context of the policy instrument called, European Fund for Most Deprived Persons. And I think this is managed not by DG Agri, but by DG Employment. And I think during at the beginning of the crisis in 2021, when food prices started to increase, I think we have increased, I think, the rate of support, I think, under this specific fund. So I don't know in Italy or in different places if I think the uptake has been increased, but clearly I think the funding has been definitely increased for the food bank. On the food transparency, as I said, I think we have established now. We had the first meeting in July, I think this year, I think VIAFCO, I think this market observatory of the agri-food chain, where basically we are gathering together, I think, the public authorities from the 27 member states, but also all the key stakeholders of the food chain, starting, I think, with fertilizers, etc., so the input up to the consumers. And we are discussing about, we are bringing data about, I think, prices, cost structure, margin, value added, etc. We are looking at some specific sectors, and we are the ultimate objective is basically to bring transparency, to build trust, and to also have share, if possible, a common diagnostic about, I think, what is happening on the food chain, what are the issues, specific issues of quantity, of availability, of affordability, of functioning. I think we have seen at the time of COVID that there were some difficulties in some region in terms of food availability. So this AFCO, I think this market observatory for the agri-food chain, is there to bring all this information, and hopefully I think in a few years maybe I think we will have more solid and updated data in order to understand, I think, the root causes of some time, I think, of some asymmetry in price transmission, in the partiality of this transmission, in the distribution of the value added, etc. I think we will have more data. So I think we are starting now with that. We have also created, we were talking about fertilizers, we have also created a market observatory for fertilizers. So we're investing quite a lot in the provision, I think, and the supply of data in order to bring, transparency and better understanding of market development in all the different fields, I think, of the food system. And this is something that is very important, and I think this is one of the remarks I wanted to do, I think, to the representative of Nestlé, is that I think our commissioner now is called Commissioner for Agriculture and Food. And this is no mistake, is that I think now we increasingly want to address, I think, the concern of the agricultural sector in a more holistic, manner. I think looking at the whole food system at large, because clearly, consumers, I think the way we process, sell, etc., sell food is important. And maybe I think now that I've got the floor, I would like to just to make a point, I think, to one of the issues raised by Anne, is that we have evidence, I think, in the EU. And in particular, I've seen, I think, reports in France about the impact of this high food inflation on food consumption and on the nutritional composition, I think, of food. And clearly, I think we, for the first time in more than 60 years in France, we have seen, in volume term, we have seen food consumption going down. And for the low-income part, I think, of society, we have seen that, I think, the nutritional value of the food consumed, I think, was going down also for this low-income household. So just to say that I think these are issues which are a bit outside, I think, the common agricultural policy, but of course, which are, of concern, and we are trying to increase and improve, I think, the monitoring of these developments. So this is part, I think, of this food system approach that we would like to build. But clearly, in terms of policy action, we have, I think, the CAP for the primary sector. We have more regulatory approach for the rest of the chain, but I think these are things that we are trying to look at, in a more holistic way now than I think as it was done in the past.